Do you know what it feels like when a story whispers to you in the dark, when it crawls under your skin before you even understand what it means? This is one of those stories, and once you hear it, you'll never look at the idea of family the same way again. In the quiet town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, behind the manicured lawns and smiling church gatherings, stood a house that pulsed with secrets. A Victorian mansion, tall and proud, like a sentinel from another age. To the townsfolk, it was a picture of elegance, but to those who dared to look closer, it was something else entirely. Because inside that house, Howard and Margaret Folling weren't raising a family. They were cultivating something far more dangerous. On paper, their story seemed like a miracle, a wealthy, respectable couple who couldn't have children of their own, opening their doors to the unwanted, the abandoned, the forgotten. 12 children in total, adopted over 15 years. 12 lives pulled from the system, saved from obscurity. At least, that's how it was presented. That's the narrative the town was sold, but the truth is always buried beneath the version you're supposed to believe. And the first detail, the one so chilling you can feel its weight already, is this. Not one of those children had a birth certificate. Not a single scrap of official record to prove where they came from, who they belonged to, or even if they were supposed to exist at all. Think about that. In a country that documents everything, where paper trails follow you from the moment you draw your first breath, these children were ghosts on arrival, and no one asked why. No judge, no agency, no neighbor ever pressed for an answer. Because the Follings projected power, wealth, and respectability, and in this world, that's all it takes to silence questions. But silence is never empty. It's the sound of fear. It's the hum of sea, Montreux, and the longer this family lived undisturbed, the louder that silence grew, until one day it started to crack. What you're about to hear is not just the story of a strange family with too many secrets. It's the anatomy of a hidden system, how power shields itself, how institutions bury truth, and how ordinary men can be conditioned to look away while something monstrous unfolds in plain sight. This is the macabre history of the Follings. Millbrook was the kind of place where darkness wasn't supposed to thrive. A town of 3,000, wrapped in rolling hills, with church steeples rising above the oaks. The Follings slipped into it like a perfect mask. Howard, the sharp-dressed banker with connections in Pittsburgh, and Margaret, the elegant nurse whose grace made everyone believe she was born to mother. Together, they bought the old Victorian on Elm Street, a house that had been left to rot, and transformed it into a palace. From the outside, it looked like a resurrection, a storybook beginning. But the truest horrors always begin dressed in light. The first child arrived in 1980, a boy named James. The town threw parties, the church blessed him, neighbors delivered casseroles. It was the image of kindness, the triumph of a couple finally becoming a family. But what no one noticed, or chose not to notice, was Margaret's obsession. She clutched James like prey, refusing to let others hold him, guarding him with a stare so sharp it made people uneasy. When the pastor asked to carry the boy for a blessing, she froze like a cornered animal. That was the first fracture in the mask, the first sign that this wasn't motherhood, as anyone knew it. But the community smoothed it over. They told themselves it was normal protectiveness. After all, who wanted to accuse a grieving woman of loving too much? Within 5 years, there were 5 children, each one arriving with suspicious speed, as though the long grind of adoption law didn't apply to the Follings. Thomas, Elizabeth, Catherine, William, all of them pulled into the orbit of this carefully curated household. None of them ever appeared in school. None of them were registered in the system. They were homeschooled, isolated, and bound to their parents' watchful eyes. People would see them rarely, and when they did, something about the children unsettled them. Hey, we're too quiet. too controlled. Their eyes didn't dart around like children's eyes should. They watched, they waited, they obeyed. But here's the part that should chill you. The system looked away. Not by accident. Howard's money flowed into the right places. Margaret's charm disarmed suspicion. Judges signed papers faster than they should have. Agencies bent rules until they snapped. It was as if every layer of authority wanted to believe the story instead of the truth. And that's the first hidden lesson buried in this tale. Power is not about wealth or respect. It's about the ability to bend reality, to convince the world not to see what's right in front of them. The mask held for 7 years. To the casual observer, the Follings were a gift to Millbrook. They hosted church events, donated to charities, kept their estate pristine. But control always has a crack, and in the summer of 1987, the first fracture widened and Thomas, 9 years old, fell from a tree in the backyard, snapping his arm clean. A normal family would have rushed him to the emergency room. Margaret, with her nursing background, did something else. She locked the wound inside the house. She tried to reset the bone herself. Imagine the pain. A child's arm broken, bleeding, mangled, and instead of help, he's forced to submit to the hands of a mother who refused hospitals, refused witnesses. Infection set in. Fever followed when Thomas began to slip toward death. Howard finally broke Margaret's rule and dragged him to the ER. That's where they met Dr. Sarah Chen. She was trained to save lives, but she also had eyes that noticed what others ignored. Thomas didn't cry, not once. He sat through agony in a silence that wasn't courage, but conditioning. He looked to his father before answering questions, waiting for permission to speak. Dr. Chen asked for medical records. There were none. The Follings told her the files burned in a mysterious fire. When she pressed, Howard's politeness broke. He threatened. He hinted that her career could suffer. And in a small town where the Follings were untouchable, she knew what that meant. Still, she filed a report with Child Protective Services. A caseworker came, walked through the mansion, saw clean floors and well-fed children, and closed the file within weeks. No abuse, no neglect, just a misunderstanding. The report vanished into bureaucracy, and Millbrook went back to sleep. Do you see what happened here? The first real chance to pierce the mask was smothered, not because evidence was missing, but because no one wanted to belie it. Virginia authority protects itself first. Systems exist not to rescue children, but to protect the image of order. The child's broken arm was written off as bad judgment, not a pattern. And with that, the Follings learned something vital. They could do anything, and the world would look away. The infection in Thomas's arm eventually healed, but what was rotting inside that house was just beginning to spread. By 1990, the mansion on Elm Street had swollen with children. 9 in total, each one absorbed into Margaret's obsessive orbit. Yet the town rarely saw them. When they appeared in public, they moved as a single unit, seated in church pews like carved statues. No whispers, no fidgeting, no life in their eyes. Neighbors whispered later that the children looked drained, as though something vital had been siphoned from them. But whispers don't stop predators. They only fertilize the soil of fear. The truth of that house was ritualized control. Children homeschooled in isolation, denied friendships, denied freedom. Margaret shifted rules constantly, ensuring no child ever knew where safety ended and punishment began. One wrong glance could mean hours of standing in silence. A word spoken without permission could mean an entire night upright in the corner, watched by Margaret's shadow until their small bodies trembled from exhaustion. Imagine being raised not in a home, but in a laboratory of obedience. And still, the world praised the Follings. Howard sat on boards of charities, smiled at galas, and funded scholarships. Margaret was called a saint by women at church, her sacrifice admired, her selflessness envied. No one asked why she never allowed her children to mingle with others, why they flinched when strangers spoke. No one demanded to see records, because the illusion of goodness is more powerful than truth. Communities cling to it like a drug. It was around this time that rumors began to leak from inside the mansion. Staff came and went quickly, maids, tutors, housekeepers who never lasted more than months. They left town quietly, refusing to explain. It was easier to vanish than to challenge the Follings. Easier to erase yourself than to risk being erased by them. And with every departure, the silence around the family thickened. This is what you need to understand. Institutions are not built to protect the weak. They are built to preserve their own image. A wealthy man with influence can build walls of respectability higher than any truth can climb. And while those walls stand, children can disappear behind them, unseen, uncounted, unprotected. By 1990, the Follings had created something monstrous in plain sight. A family that wasn't a family, children who weren't documented, and a house that became less a home than a machine for control. And still, the world applauded. But the machine was far from finished. The turning point came in the winter of 1992, when a new family moved into Millbrook. Michael and Susan Fletcher weren't locals, and that made them dangerous. Outsiders don't carry the same blind loyalty to community myths. Michael was a journalist, Susan a social worker, and they brought with them a way of seeing that pierced through illusions. From the very beginning, Susan noticed what others refused to acknowledge. The falling children did not act like children. They flinched at sudden noises, avoided eye contact, and seemed to constantly check Margaret's face, as though reading her for cues of permission. These were not signs of shyness. They were signs of conditioning. Susan had worked with traumatized children before. She recognized it instantly. At first, she tried the subtle route, befriending Margaret, visiting for coffee, listening to the carefully curated stories of motherhood that Margaret spun. But she also observed, quietly, relentlessly, the locked third-floor door, the muffled sounds of shuffling and crying from behind it, the excuses about storage and old house noises, the sudden glimpse of a girl at a window Susan had never seen before, a girl who vanished when their eyes met. Margaret brushed it off, but Susan wasn't fooled. Meanwhile, Michael was digging into his own field. Adoption fraud. His articles for the Millbrook Gazette exposed shuttered agencies in Pennsylvania and beyond. Places accused of moving children without proper records, bending the law to place the unplaceable. The timeline of those agencies matched almost perfectly with the Follings' rapid expansion of their family. The coincidences were too neat. The story began to feel less like philanthropy and more like procurement. It was after those articles ran that the Follings announced 3 more adoptions, twins, Peter and Paul, and then a girl named Mary. 11 children in total. Now, 11 shadows without official roots. And this is where the story sharpens into something larger than a family scandal. Because what the Fletchers stumbled into was not just a mystery about one couple's strange obsession. It was a system, a web of agencies, judges, and bureaucrats who allowed children to vanish into paperwork black holes. Children without names, without histories, without legal existence. Ask yourself, how many layers of silence had to be stacked for this to happen? How many officials had to look away? How many neighbors had to swallow their questions? Evil doesn't thrive because it's strong. It thrives because people are too weak to confront it. And in Millbrook, that weakness was everywhere. By 1993, Susan Fletcher's quiet observations had grown into something heavier, a file thick with notes, photographs, and timelines. She wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was certain. The Falling household wasn't merely strange. It was constructed for control. The children weren't loved. They were contained. But the question still loomed like a blade. Contained for what? The answer began to whisper from the locked third floor. Neighbors had long whispered about the mansion, but Susan heard the sounds herself. Soft crying, a shuffling of feet, sometimes the faint rise of voices trying to sing, as if to comfort themselves in captivity. These weren't the voices of the 11 adopted children the Follings paraded before the town. This was something else. Someone else. One evening, Susan saw it with her own eyes, a girl's face framed in the third-floor window. Dark hair, pale skin, a child who didn't belong to any of the names on Margaret's carefully rehearsed list. The girl disappeared before Susan could call Michael over. And just like that, Susan understood. There were more children in that house than anyone knew. Children who existed without records, without paperwork, without acknowledgement. Ghost children. Michael, meanwhile, was uncovering the machinery behind it all. Adoption agencies scattered across states, loopholes exploited by wealthy couples, donations slipped into the right hands. Every time the Follings acquired another child, paperwork trails bent and vanished. Sometimes, within weeks of their adoptions, another child would go missing in the same region. Poor children, foster children, children no one tracked closely. They slipped through the cracks, and once inside those cracks, they disappeared into Elm Street. It became clear to the Fletchers. This wasn't random. It was a method. The Follings weren't just building a family. They were harvesting children out of reach of law, protected by wealth and influence. But knowledge is dangerous when you carry it alone. Susan confided in only a few, choosing carefully whom to trust. She worried about the power the Follings held in town. She worried about what might happen if they suspected she had seen too much. Because predators who thrive on silence do not forgive those who break it. And beneath it all, one fact gnawed at her. If she could see the cracks so clearly, then surely others had too. So why hadn't anyone acted? Because fear is the real warden. And in Millbrook, the prison of fear had already been built long before the children entered it. Susan knew she couldn't carry this weight alone anymore. Every time she drove past the mansion, every time she imagined that pale girl in the third-floor window, her chest tightened. Silence was no longer survival. It was complicity. So she turned to someone she hoped she could trust, Detective Alan Cooper. Cooper wasn't from Millbrook either. He had transferred from Pittsburgh after his wife's death, and unlike the local officers who treated the Follings like royalty, Cooper had no loyalty to their legend. He was blunt, weary, and sharp enough to hear the urgency in Susan's voice when she laid out her file. At first, he thought it was another overactive social worker connecting dots where none existed. But then Susan showed him the dates. Missing child reports aligned almost perfectly with each new Falling adoption. He studied photos she'd taken discreetly. Children in public, never smiling, never unmonitored, always moving like shadows tethered to Margaret's gaze. And finally, he listened to a recording. Susan had pressed a small tape recorder against the side of the mansion one night. The tape hissed, then carried faint voices, children reciting prayers in unison. The cadence was unnatural, rehearsed, like a chant drilled into them. That was the moment Cooper's skepticism cracked. He knew what institutionalized children sounded like. He knew how repetition stripped individuality. These weren't prayers of comfort. They were liturgies of control. But Cooper also knew something else. Moving against the Follings would not be simple. He had already seen how their influence reached the courts, the council, even his own department. One wrong step, and his badge would be gone. Worse, Susan's life could be at risk. So he began cautiously, Late-night drives past the mansion. Discreet checks of hospital and adoption records. Quiet conversations with retired officers who would meme it off the record that complaints about the Follings had surfaced before, always dismissed, always buried. Each clue was a spark. Together they began to illuminate a picture that was no longer just disturbing. It was criminal. It was organized. It was systemic. But here's the truth about uncovering rot. The closer you get, the more it notices you, and soon the Follings knew they were being watched. It began subtly, the way all warnings do. A car idling across the street from the Fletcher's house at night, its headlights off. Anonymous phone calls that fell silent the moment Susan answered. Mail opened before it reached their door. To anyone else, these were small coincidences. To Susan and Cooper, they were signals. The Follings knew. Susan's anxiety grew sharper. At the grocery store, she caught Margaret watching her from the far end of an aisle, smiling faintly, not approaching, just watching. At church, Howard shook Michael's hand with a grip too tight, his eyes cold even as his mouth stretched into a politician's grin. Every encounter was a reminder. We see you. Cooper tried to reassure her, but he wasn't blind. His own phone had started clicking with interference during calls. Files he requested from out-of-state agencies arrived mysteriously lost or misfiled. Someone with reach was closing doors before he could open them. This wasn't just a family secret. It was a network protecting itself. One night, after leaving Susan's house, Cooper noticed a black sedan tailing him through the back roads of Millbrook. He pulled over suddenly, lights flashing, ready to confront. But the car slowed, paused at a distance, then turned and disappeared into the dark. No plates he could trace, just a shadow reminding him of how exposed he was. Susan, meanwhile, began noticing changes in the children themselves. During rare glimpses outside the mansion, they appeared thinner, paler. One boy had a deep bruise across his arm. Another limped slightly. These were not children simply homeschooled. They were deteriorating. Whatever was happening behind those locked doors was escalating. And then came the clearest warning of all. Late one night, Susan returned to her car after leaving the library. On the windshield was a single Polaroid. It showed her standing outside the kitchen. Falling mansion days earlier, her eyes lifted to the third-floor window. The message was silent but unmistakable. We are watching you watch us. The game had shifted. This was no longer investigation. It was survival. Cooper knew they couldn't wait for paperwork, not when children's lives might be on the line. So one stormy night in early spring, he and Susan made the choice that would change everything. They would go inside. Not legally, not with a warrant, but quietly, in the dark. The plan was simple. The Follings were hosting a benefit dinner at the country club, a fundraiser Margaret had spent weeks planning. Most of the household staff would be there too, dressed up as part of the spectacle. That left the mansion quiet, unguarded, or so they hoped. They parked 2 streets away and approached on foot. The rain masked their movements, the wind covered their breath. Cooper carried a flashlight wrapped in red film to mute the beam. Susan clutched a notebook like a lifeline. The first floor was immaculate, staged like a museum. Family portraits, heavy curtains, polished wood. Nothing out of place. Too perfect, too curated, a house meant to be seen, not lived in. But when they reached the second floor, the illusion began to crack. The children's bedrooms were small, sparse. No toys, no drawings on the walls. Each room nearly identical, as though designed from a template. Beds lined up with military precision, sheets tucked sharp enough to cut. Susan's throat tightened. "This isn't a home," she whispered. "It's a barracks." And then they found the third-floor door. Heavy, iron-reinforced, locked with 2 deadbolts and a chain. A lock on the inside of a family home rarely means safety. It means containment. Cooper pressed his ear to the wood. For a moment, nothing. Then, faint shuffling, a cough, the quiet sound of someone crying into their own hands. Susan's eyes widened. The confirmation she dreaded was right there, inches away. But before Cooper could try the lock, a sound tore through the silence, the creak of footsteps on the stairs below. Not slow, not cautious. Measured, deliberate, someone else was in the house. They killed the light instantly. Heartbeats pounded in the dark. The storm outside roared, but inside the mansion, another kind of storm was moving closer. The footsteps rose steadily, each creak of the staircase like a hammer against Susan's chest. Cooper pulled her into the shadows of the hallway, one finger pressed to his lips. The beam of a flashlight swept across the wall below, then another. 2 lights. 2 people. The Follings hadn't all gone to the country club. Someone had stayed behind. The lights paused at the 2nd floor. A man's voice, calm, rehearsed, almost gentle, called out, "Children, back to bed now." But it wasn't a father's tone. It was the voice of a warden speaking to prisoners. Susan gripped Cooper's arm. He didn't move. The footsteps turned down the hallway, toward the rows of identical bedrooms. The flashlight beams pierced under doors, checking, verifying. Whoever this was, he knew the routine. When the lights passed, Cooper pulled Susan toward the 3rd-floor door. He tried the bolts again, solid. No chance of breaking through without sound. He leaned close to the keyhole and whispered, "We'll come back." But then came the sound that froze them both, a small hand pounding against the inside of the door. Not loud, desperate, rapid, the muffled cry of a child too weak to form words. Susan's face went pale. She reached for the door instinctively, but Cooper pulled her back, shaking his head. The footsteps below had stopped. Whoever was patrolling had heard it too. For a breathless moment, the mansion was silent. All 3 parties listening, the trapped child, the intruders, and the guardian moving through the dark. Then the man's voice rang out again, this time sharper. "Quiet! Now!" The pounding ceased, the silence returned, and the footsteps turned back toward the stairs. Susan wanted to scream. Cooper forced her toward the back staircase, whispering harshly, "We can't save them tonight. If we die in here, no one ever will." They slipped into the storm as the lights moved back to the first floor. But Susan knew, as rain soaked her to the bone, that the children upstairs knew someone had been there. Someone had heard them, and nothing was more dangerous than giving captives a hope that could be taken away. By morning, Susan couldn't hold it in. The pounding of that child's hand still rattled in her skull. She pressed Cooper for action, refusing to let another night pass in silence. "Alan, they're starving them. They're locking them up like prisoners. We heard it. We saw it. You can't tell me to wait." Cooper sat hunched over his desk, files spread out like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. He rubbed his eyes. "I'm not telling you to wait, because I want to. I'm telling you because if we walk into the chief's office with nothing but what we saw, the Follings will bury us, and they'll bury those kids deeper." But Susan was past caution. She typed up a full report, every suspicious adoption, every vanished birth record, every glimpse of bruises, every strange ritual overheard. She submitted it not just to the Millbrook police, but to the county, to child services in Pittsburgh, even to a journalist she knew from college. Her hands shook as she sent each copy, but she felt a rush of grim relief. At least the truth was leaving her hands. The backlash was immediate. Her supervisor at social services called her into his office, face pale. "Susan, withdraw this. Do you understand me? Families like the Follings, they don't get touched." At the station, Cooper got colder treatment. His captain didn't shout. He just closed the file in front of him and said, "You're chasing ghosts, Cooper. Let it go, or transfer again." Even Michael, Susan's husband, begged her to stop. "We came here for peace," he said, voice trembling. "Not to pick a fight we can't win." But Susan's resolve hardened. If peace means pretending not to hear children crying for help, then we never had it. That night, another warning arrived. A package on the Fletcher's porch. Inside was one of Michael's ties, carefully folded, still smelling faintly of his cologne. No note, no explanation, just a promise. The message was clear. You want a war? You have one. For weeks, Susan and Cooper had been dismissed as paranoid, reckless, even unstable. But one mistake from the Follings changed everything. It began with an anonymous envelope slipped into Cooper's station mailbox. No return address, no note, just a single document. It was a hospital birth record from 1979. The mother's name was blacked out, but the infant's identification number was still visible. Cooper cross-checked it against the Follings adoption files. The number matched exactly to one of the children currently in their care. The problem: the child's file claimed she had been adopted in 1987, 8 years later. Either someone had hidden her away all that time, or the paperwork was fabricated. Susan felt the weight of it instantly. "This isn't suspicion anymore," she whispered. "This is proof. They're forging entire lives." But the real breakthrough came when she and Cooper managed to access the county's storage archive. There, buried in boxes of old census data, they discovered a folder labeled Falling Charitable Foundation, T2. Inside were photographs of children, not a few, but dozens, lined up outside the mansion like trophies. None of those children appeared in later records. None could be traced. The photos chilled Susan to her core. The children all wore the same blank expression, as though coached or conditioned. And behind them always stood Howard and Margaret Folling, smiling like benefactors at a harvest. "This isn't philanthropy," Cooper muttered. "It's collection." When they left the archives, Susan noticed a car parked across the street, engine running. Inside, 2 men in suits, watching. They didn't speak, didn't move, just observed until she and Cooper drove away. Now, at last, they had evidence, enough to demand intervention. But with evidence came exposure. For the first time, the Follings knew they weren't just being suspected. They would push you, "You're being caught," and that made Susan realize something terrifying. Children who had survived this long might not survive much longer. Susan and Cooper didn't wait. They delivered copies of the photographs and forged birth records to the County Child Services office, to the district attorney, even slipped one packet under the newsroom door of the Pittsburgh Gazette. For the first time, it felt like the Follings' grip might actually crack. But by the next morning, the storm broke against them. The DA's office called Cooper in, not to congratulate him, but to suspend him, effective immediately, for unauthorized access to county archives and mishandling of sensitive records. His badge and firearm were taken on the spot. At the same hour, Susan was escorted from her office by security. A formal complaint had been filed against her, accusing her of falsifying reports, breaching confidentiality, and violating client trust to her supervisor wouldn't even meet her eyes. "They turned it," she whispered to Cooper later. "They turned everything back on us." That evening, the local news ran a story, not about missing children, not about suspicious adoptions, but about 2 unstable officials spreading conspiracy theories against one of Millbrook's most generous families. The segment showed Howard Falling shaking hands at a charity event, Margaret speaking softly about her unwavering love for children in need. They painted Susan and Cooper as fanatics, obsessed, unwell. Then came the part that made Susan's blood run cold. The news anchor claimed that Susan had a history of emotional instability, citing her miscarriage 3 years earlier. Information no one outside her closest circle should have known. "They're in my life," Susan whispered. "They know everything." That night, Michael begged her to stop. He admitted someone had approached him at work, 2 men in suits, polite but firm. They told him Susan's safety depended on her silence. "Please," he said, voice breaking. "I can't lose you." But Susan only shook her head. "Michael, we've already lost too much." Somewhere deep inside the falling estate, children were still waiting in locked rooms. And now Susan knew, if she didn't keep fighting, no one ever would. With their names blackened and their careers stripped away, Susan and Cooper had no choice but to go underground. Official channels were closed, every door slammed in their faces. The Follings owned the system now. Cooper's small apartment became their base, windows covered, phone pulled from the wall, typewriter clattering at night as Susan documented everything: dates, names, photographs, the inconsistencies in adoption records, the testimonies whispered to her by terrified former foster parents. They started working like fugitives. Cooper used his police contacts carefully, only reaching out to men he trusted absolutely. Most turned him away, muttering that the Follings were too big. A few slipped him scraps, rumors of sealed case files, whispers of children who had vanished without death certificates, morgue logs that never matched. Susan reached out to underground networks, churches, reformers, even fringe groups that had long accused wealthy families of ritualistic abuse. She didn't fully trust them, but she needed allies who believed. Each step forward drew the noose tighter. Strange cars idled outside their apartments at night. Susan's typewriter ribbon was once found cut clean through, though she hadn't left it that way. Cooper swore he saw the same man twice in 2 different towns, following, never speaking. One night, they returned to find Cooper's apartment door unlocked. Inside, nothing was stolen, but all their files had been neatly rearranged on the kitchen table, stacked in perfect order. A silent reminder: we can reach you any time. Fear became constant, but so did resolve. They couldn't match the Follings' power with courts or newspapers. They would have to expose them differently, through truth that couldn't be contained. Cooper tapped the photos of the children lined up outside the mansion. "We need survivors," he said quietly. "Not records, not rumors. Someone who can stand in the light and say, 'This is what they did to me.' That's the only way." Susan nodded, though her hands trembled. Survivors. Children who had escaped the mansion's grip. If they could be found at all. It took weeks of dead ends before the first lead surfaced. A retired nurse from a county hospital called Cooper in secret. She wouldn't give her name, only whispered, "There was a boy, 1983. I shouldn't be telling you this. They'll know." Then she hung up. Susan traced the fragment back through medical archives. Buried in old records was a discharge form for a child listed only as Patient X. 8 years old, severe malnutrition, fractured ribs, chemical burns across his arms. He had been brought in by a private party and removed less than 24 hours later by a guardian named Margaret Falling. After that, nothing. But Susan dug deeper. Patient X had not disappeared entirely. A social worker's notes, misfiled under a different county, mentioned that same boy 2 years later, now a teenager, living under a false surname in Pittsburgh. And then, unbelievably, there was a current address. They drove 3 hours that night, headlights cutting through rain. At the edge of the city, they found him, not a boy anymore, but a gaunt man in his 40s, working nights at a shuttered factory-turned-warehouse. His name was Daniel. At first, he refused to speak. His eyes darted to every corner, as though the walls themselves were listening. But when Susan laid the photograph on the table, the old snapshot of children lined up outside the falling mansion, Daniel froze. His hand trembled. "I remember that day," he whispered. His voice was broken, raw. "They told us to smile, told us to be proud. But when the picture was taken, one of the boys who didn't smile, they took him inside. He never came back." Susan leaned forward gently. "Daniel, what did they do to you?" He shook his head violently, tears welling. "You don't understand. Speaking about them, saying their name, brings them back. I barely got away. I hid for years. They don't forget." Cooper asked the only question that Matt read. "How many children?" Daniel's answer was almost a whisper. "More than you can count, and not all of them were meant to leave." The words hung in the air like a curse. For the first time, they weren't chasing shadows. They had a survivor. And his story was darker than anything Susan had dared to imagine. For hours, Daniel refused to go further. He drank from a chipped mug, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the door as though expecting it to burst open. Susan didn't push. She only listened, letting silence work its slow persuasion. Finally, near midnight, his voice cracked. They called it the gathering. Susan's stomach tightened. Cooper leaned in. What was it? Daniel's words came halting, as if dragged from a wound that never healed. Every few months they brought us into the great hall. Long tables, candles everywhere. Men and women in fine clothes, judges, businessmen, people with power. The Follings said they were our patrons. They watched us like livestock. He swallowed hard. They'd make us stand in lines, sing, recite prayers we didn't understand. Then they chose some of us to leave the hall. Those children, we never saw again. Susan whispered. What happened to them, Daniel? His eyes flooded. He shook his head, but words spilled anyway. They were taken downstairs, to the stone rooms beneath the mansion. You could hear it sometimes, chanting and then screaming. And after, silence. Always silence. The warehouse seemed to darken with his confession. Cooper tried to steady him. You survived. How? Daniel's jaw tightened. I learned to disappear, to be invisible. Smile when they said, pray when they said, cry only when it was allowed. The ones who resisted, they didn't last. Then he leaned forward, voice trembling with urgency. You think exposing them will end it, but you don't understand. The Follings aren't just a family. They're a doorway. People come from everywhere to feed on what happens in that house. If you pull at this, you're not just fighting them. You're fighting everyone who's ever feasted there. Susan's pen shook in her hand. She realized what Daniel had given them wasn't just testimony. It was a map of something larger, something that stretched beyond Millbrook. And for the first time, she understood why so many people in power had turned against her. Susan knew Daniel's story was the crack in the wall they had been waiting for. If he spoke publicly, if he stood in front of a camera, no smear campaign could erase him. A living witness could shatter the Follings' carefully built illusion. But Daniel shook his head violently when they suggested it. You don't get it. The moment I speak, I'm dead. They'll find me. They always find us. Cooper leaned forward, voice steady. Then let us protect you. We can hide you, move you, but we need your testimony recorded, even if it's just on tape. If something happens to you, your words will still live. Daniel's breathing grew ragged. He stared at the floor, hands gripping his knees. Finally, he whispered, Maybe just a recording. They arranged to meet the next night in the warehouse's back office. Susan set up an old tape recorder, the reels humming. Daniel sat across from them, pale under the dim bulb. His voice quivered, but he began to recount everything. The gathering, the rituals, the disappearances, each word carved into the silence like a blade. But halfway through his account, a noise echoed in the distance, a sharp metallic clang, like a door slamming. Daniel froze. Cooper's hand went to the revolver he kept tucked in his jacket. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, more than one pair. Daniel's face drained of color. "It's them," he whispered. The warehouse lights flickered. Susan snatched the recorder, clutching it to her chest. Cooper motioned for silence. They moved toward the back exit, hearts pounding, as the footsteps drew closer. When they reached the alley, Susan dared a glance over her shoulder. At the far end of the warehouse stood two figures in black coats, motionless, watching. They didn't chase. They only watched. Daniel was shaking uncontrollably. "I told you," he muttered. "They don't let anyone leave once the secrets are spoken." Susan held the recorder tighter. Now she had the proof in her hands, but the Follings knew. And that meant Daniel's time, and possibly theirs, was running out. They didn't sleep that night. Susan kept the recorder on the table between them, as if it were a fragile relic that might vanish if she looked away. The reels held Daniel's voice, trembling but undeniable, a direct account of the Follings' rituals. It was proof, but proof can also be bait. By morning, Cooper's police contacts were no longer answering calls. One finally picked up, voice strained. "You need to stop. They know what you have." Then the line went dead. Daniel wouldn't leave his room. He sat in the corner, rocking, whispering prayers. Every sound outside, the rumble of a truck, the slam of a door, made him flinch. Susan argued for sending the tape to the press immediately. "Even if they kill us, the story gets out." Cooper disagreed. "The moment we release it without protection, it'll vanish. They'll bury the broadcast, silence the station, destroy the copies. We need leverage, something that forces them to back off." But that night, the choice was ripped away. When they returned from buying food, the apartment door was ajar. Inside, the place was ransacked, but only one thing was missing: the tape. Daniel sat frozen on the bed, wide-eyed. On the wall above him, scrawled in something dark and wet, was a message. "No voices, no witnesses." Susan's legs nearly gave out. The recorder, their lifeline, was gone. The Follings hadn't just found them. They were already inside. Daniel began to sob. "It's over. They'll take me back. They always do." But Susan refused. Her hands shook, but her voice was steel. "No, Daniel. If they want silence, then we'll give them the opposite. We go louder, wider. They can't kill the story if we spread it faster than they can bury it." For the first time, Cooper didn't argue. He only nodded. Because now, survival wasn't about them. It was about making sure Daniel's story, every nightmare he had endured, could never be erased. And that meant going to war with the Follings in the open. Susan moved fast that night. She transcribed every word she remembered from Daniel's testimony. She knew it wasn't as strong as the tape, but it was something, and something could spread. At a dimly lit diner with sticky tables and broken blinds, she slid a folded packet across to a young journalist she trusted. No names, no explanations, just the truth on paper. By dawn, the story appeared on an underground blog known for publishing leaked documents. The headline was blunt: "The Children of the Follings, Testimony of a Survivor." Within hours, it had been reposted, screenshotted, mirrored across forums and message boards. The words couldn't be called back. Daniel's story was free, but with freedom came fire. News anchors dismissed it as conspiracy. A polished lawyer for the Follings called it a work of fiction designed to harass a respected family. On television, they laughed at it, rolling their eyes. Yet in the comments sections, in the shadows of the internet, people whispered. Some claimed to know, some claimed to remember. And then came the backlash. Cars began to circle Susan's block at night. Cooper's phone lit up with threats, deep, rasping voices promising he would burn for his trespass. Daniel disappeared for hours, then returned pale, muttering that he had seen a man watching him from the corner. The Follings didn't need to kill the story outright. They needed to crush the people behind it, to make them vanish until the words looked like nothing more than a ghost tale. But Susan wasn't backing down. Standing in the dark, with the glow of her laptop, she typed the last line of a new article, her name finally attached. "If anything happens to me, you'll know why." She hit publish. And at that moment, the war was no longer quiet. At first, it seemed like the Follings were winning. News outlets mocked Susan's article. Panels of experts dismissed it as hysteria. But in the hidden corners of the internet, something new began to stir. People started digging. A retired court clerk posted scans of sealed adoption papers that bore the Falling name. A former custodian uploaded photos of a tunnel beneath the old Millbrook courthouse, claiming it led toward the Falling estate. And then came the video. It appeared on a fringe forum in the middle of the night. Grainy footage of a stone chamber lit by candles, a group of children kneeling as figures in dark robes circled them. The quality was poor, the faces blurred, but in the center of the room, unmistakable even through the static, was the Falling crest carved into the wall. The clip spread faster than the Fallings could erase it. Every time a takedown notice was filed, 3 more copies appeared. Susan watched in stunned silence as the video played on her laptop. Daniel refused to look, his hands pressed over his ears. "I told you," he whispered, rocking in the corner. "I told you, no one leaves once they see the truth." Cooper leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just rumor anymore. This is evidence." But evidence cut both ways. The leak had crossed a line the Fallings couldn't ignore. That same night, a fire broke out at the warehouse where they had first recorded Daniel. The flames gutted the building, leaving nothing but blackened beams. On the smoldering wall, spray-painted in stark red letters, was a single word: enough. Susan's phone buzzed moments later, an unknown number. She answered, voice shaking. A calm, measured voice spoke. "We let you run this far to see how bold you'd become, but now you will stop, or the boy will go back underground, and this time, he won't come back." She froze. The line clicked dead. The war had gone public, but the Fallings had just made it personal. The call left the room in silence. Daniel sat trembling, eyes wide, rocking harder now, whispering fragments of prayers. He didn't need Susan to explain who the boy meant. He knew. Cooper locked the doors, checked the windows, and placed his revolver on the table in plain sight. "We're past hiding. They're coming for him, and if they take him back, he's gone for good." Susan's mind raced. She'd thought publishing the story would shield them, that the spotlight would make the Fallings cautious. But she understood now, the Fallings didn't care about exposure. They only cared about control. If that meant burning buildings and killing witnesses in full view, they would. "Then we don't wait for them," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried steel. "We move Daniel somewhere they can't reach him. We force them into the open." But Daniel snapped his head up, panic in his voice. "No, there is no safe place. They have eyes everywhere. The only thing they fear is their own blood." Susan frowned. "What do you mean, their own blood?" Daniel hesitated, as if speaking the words themselves might summon punishment. Then he whispered, "The Fallings aren't just a family. They're a covenant. And if you want to wound the covenant, you go after the root, the founder's line." Cooper stiffened. "Are you saying there's someone above the family we already see?" Daniel nodded slowly. "She's still alive. They call her the matron. Every order comes from her. Hurt her, and the rest unravel." The room fell into a heavy silence. Susan finally spoke. "Then we find her." Cooper didn't argue. He just reloaded his gun. Because now the fight wasn't about survival. It was about cutting into the heart of the Follings themselves. Before the Follings carved Daniel back into the dark, the name matron lingered in the room like smoke. Neither Susan nor Cooper spoke for a long while, afraid that saying it aloud too often might summon her. But silence wasn't safety. Susan began digging, tracing every scrap of genealogy tied to the Falling line. On brittle archives and half-forgotten family registries, one name recurred in whispers. Eleanor Falling, born 1899, declared dead in 1963. Except the death certificate was a forgery. An archivist who owed Cooper a favor confirmed it. Records had been altered, sealed, and rewritten under a judge who'd since vanished, and there were rumors, stretching decades, of an old woman seen at Falling gatherings, her face veiled, her voice low but commanding. Always the same description, always referred to as the matron. Susan's pulse quickened as she read an account buried in a local paper from the 1970s. A caretaker dismissed from the Falling estate claimed he had served meals to a woman who should have been in her grave. Daniel wouldn't meet their eyes as she read it aloud. Instead, he muttered, "She feeds on time, on us. She doesn't die. She makes others do it for her." That night, Susan cross-referenced recent property filings. One entry leapt out, an anonymous trust owning a sprawling estate less than 30 miles from where they sat. The trust name was meaningless, but the land records showed something chilling. The original deed, signed in 1921, bore the name Eleanor Falling. It had never changed hands. Cooper tapped the map with his finger, jaw tight. "That's her. Has to be. She never left." The realization settled like ice in Susan's chest. They hadn't been chasing ghosts across generations. The ghost was still alive, and she was watching them from just down the road. The estate loomed on the map like a wound. Acres of forest, a winding drive, and a house that looked less like a home and more like a fortress. Cooper spread the layout across the table, his revolver beside him, his cigarette burning low. "We don't get a second chance. If she's there, the whole Covenant is circling that place. Guards, watchers, maybe worse. We walk in blind. We don't walk out." Susan didn't argue. She could feel the gravity of it, the sense that every road they'd taken had been funneling them here. Every testimony, every whisper, every scar on Daniel's arms pointed to this one address. "We'll need proof," she said finally. "Not just our eyes, something undeniable." Cooper nodded. "I'll handle protection. You handle exposure. If we get one shot, you better make it loud enough the world can't look away." In the corner, Daniel shivered beneath his blanket. His voice was barely audible. "She'll know you're coming. She always knows. The walls talk, the birds talk, the air itself. She hears it all." Susan knelt beside him, steadying his gaze. "Daniel, listen to me. You've carried this your whole life. But if we face her, if we see her, will you speak? Will you tell the world what she is?" His lips trembled. Then, slowly, he nodded. That was enough. By midnight, the car was packed. Cooper checked the revolver twice, then slipped a hunting knife into his boot. Susan carried only her laptop, her recorder, and a small camera that could stream in real time if she pressed a single button. The road to the estate was long and unlit, swallowed by forest. Every mile felt like it erased the chance of turning back. And in the back seat, Daniel whispered one final warning. "She won't look old when you see her. She'll look like something else. Don't believe your eyes." The estate appeared out of the trees like a shadow made solid. Towers of black stone, windows glowing faintly with an amber light, the long drive curling like a serpent toward a set of iron gates. Susan felt her throat tighten. The house didn't look abandoned. It looked awake. Cooper cut the headlights and rolled the car to a stop 50 yards from the gate. "From here, it's on foot," he muttered, sliding the revolver into his coat. The forest was heavy with silence as they moved, only the crunch of leaves underfoot. Daniel clung to Susan's sleeve, whispering faster now, words tumbling over one another. Prayers, warnings, fragments of songs he'd been forced to chant as a child. The gate was unlocked. Too easy. Inside the grounds, the air seemed thicker, harder to breathe. Statues lined the path, children carved in marble, their faces blurred by moss and time. Susan's stomach turned when she realized every statue bore the same initials etched at its base. DF. Daniel froze. His voice cracked. "Those are the ones who didn't survive." The front doors of the house opened before they could reach them. A figure stood silhouetted in the glow, tall, draped in black, her veil trailing to the floor. The matron. Susan's pulse thundered. For a moment she thought she was seeing a woman, no older than 50. Poised, graceful, unshaken. But when the light shifted, the illusion rippled, like skin stretched too tight across something not meant to be human. Her voice carried across the courtyard, calm, melodic, and cold. "You've brought the boy back to me, and the witnesses too. How thoughtful." Cooper raised his gun without hesitation. "We're not leaving without the truth." The matron tilted her head, and the faintest smile crossed her lips. "The truth?" she whispered. "Then step inside and see what truth costs." The doors yawned open wider. The house swallowed the light, waiting. And with no way back, Susan stepped forward. The air inside was suffocating. The walls seemed too close, lined with portraits of the falling bloodline, each pair of painted eyes tracking them as they crossed the threshold. The house was warm, but Susan shivered. The matron glided ahead of them without a sound, her veil brushing the marble floor. "You wanted proof," she said softly. "Then watch." With a slow gesture, she opened a door into a vast chamber. At first, Susan thought it was a banquet hall. Then she realized the long table was not set with food, but with ledgers, contracts, and files. Each one stamped with seals of banks, courts, hospitals, every corner of society bent to the Follings' will. "This is the covenant," the matron said. "Every name, every debt, every life owed to us. We are not hidden. We are the ground you walk on." Cooper stepped closer, gun trained on her chest. "You're just parasites. It ends tonight." The matron laughed, low, almost kind. Then she lifted her veil. Susan's stomach dropped. The face beneath was neither young nor old. It shifted as she looked at it, a child's smooth skin rippling into the sag of age, then back again. Eyes that belonged to no single lifetime, burning with an unnatural hunger. Daniel collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. "Don't look at her! Don't look too long!" Susan snapped her camera on, streaming everything live. The matron's gaze darted to the red recording light. For the first time, her expression faltered. "You think eyes on me will save you?" she hissed. "The world has seen worse and called it normal. They will forget you tomorrow." But Cooper didn't wait. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the chamber. The matron staggered, black liquid blooming across her veil. But she did not fall. Instead, she shrieked, a sound that rattled the glass in the portraits. From the walls, the painted eyes seemed to widen. The whole house groaned like it was alive. Susan grabbed Daniel and bolted for the door. Cooper fired again, then again, buying them seconds. The matron's form flickered with each shot, twisting, unraveling, but never collapsing. They crashed through the front doors into the night air, running across the courtyard as the house shuddered behind them. When they reached the tree line, Cooper stumbled out last, his face pale. "She's not dead," he gasped. "She'll never die." Susan's camera was still rolling, her stream still live. Thousands of viewers already watching, commenting, spreading the images of the matron's distorted face. The Follings' great secret was no longer hidden, but as the estate roared with inhuman fury behind them, Susan felt no victory, only the certainty that exposing the covenant was just the beginning. Because the matron wasn't finished, she was hunting now,